My name is Walter Granger, and at 81 years old I never thought I'd be writing this story. But here I am, sitting in what used to be my favorite chair in my own living room, watching my son Greg and his wife Denise act like I'm already dead. I built this house with my own hands back in 1968, when I was still working as a civil engineer for the county. Dorothy and I designed every room, picked out every fixture, planted every tree in the yard. We raised Greg here, watched him take his first steps on these hardwood floors, taught him to ride his bike in this very driveway. For 53 years this house has been my sanctuary, my monument to a life well lived. Dorothy passed 2 years ago come October. Cancer took her quick, which I suppose was a mercy. Greg seemed genuinely torn up about it at the funeral, and for a while there I thought maybe losing his mother would bring us closer together. Lord knows we needed something to bridge the gap that had been growing between us for years. I built this house with my own hands back in 1968, when I was still working as a civil engineer for the county. Dorothy and I designed every room, picked out every fixture, planted every tree in the yard. We raised Greg here, watched him take his first steps on these hardwood floors, taught him to ride his bike in this very driveway. For 53 years this house has been my sanctuary, my monument to a life well lived. My name is Walter Granger, and at 81 years old I never thought I'd be writing this story. But here I am, sitting in what used to be my favorite chair in my own living room, watching my son Greg and his wife Denise act like I'm already dead. What kind of father says no to his only child? Especially when that child is standing there with his wife, looking like the world's about to end. Dorothy would have wanted me to help. She always said family comes first, no matter what, so I moved my things out of the master bedroom and told them to make themselves at home. That was my first mistake. When Greg and Denise showed up on my doorstep last spring with their suitcases and that look of desperation, I didn't hesitate. "Dad, we're in a bit of a bind," Greg said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Denise lost her job at the bank and we're behind on the mortgage. Could we maybe stay here for a few months, just until we get back on our feet? Move on." As if 53 years of marriage was just clutter to be boxed up and stored in the basement. At first, things seemed normal enough. Denise would cook dinner sometimes, and Greg would help with the yard work. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings talking about his job search and her plans to find something new. But slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, things started to change. It started with little things. Denise would serve dinner but forget to set a place for me. "Oh, I thought you'd already eaten," she'd say when I'd come to the table. Or she'd make plans to redecorate the living room without asking, boxing up Dorothy's things and replacing them with her own. "Dad, you don't need all these old memories cluttering up the place," Greg would say when I'd object. "Mom's been gone 2 years. It's time to move on." The real wake-up call came on a Thursday afternoon in August. I'd been out at Earl Tate's construction office going over some blueprints for a renovation project he was bidding on. Earl and I have been friends since high school, and he still values my opinion on structural engineering matters even though I've been retired for 16 years. When I came home around 4 o'clock I found the front door locked. Now I've lived in this house for over 50 years, and I've never locked that door during the day. Never had to. Dover Springs is the kind of town where people still leave their doors unlocked and their keys in the ignition. But there I was, standing on my own front porch, digging through my pockets for my house key like some kind of stranger. When I finally got inside I found Greg and Denise in the kitchen whispering over some paperwork. They looked up when I walked in and I saw something in their eyes I didn't like. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. "Dad, we need to talk," Greg said. But his voice sounded different, harder. "Denise and I have been thinking. This house is too big for you to manage on your own. Maybe it's time to consider some other options." "This is my home," I said quietly. "I built it with my own hands. I'm not going anywhere." "Other options." I looked around at the kitchen Dorothy and I had remodeled 10 years ago, at the breakfast nook where we'd shared our morning coffee for decades, at the window that looks out onto the garden where she grew her prize-winning tomatoes. Other options. Living alone. I looked at the two of them sitting at my kitchen table, in my house, making plans for my future, and I realized something that chilled me to the bone. I was living alone. Even with them here, even with their voices filling the rooms Dorothy and I had shared, I was completely, utterly alone. Greg and Denise exchanged a look. "Dad, be reasonable," Denise said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. "You can't take care of a place this size anymore. And frankly, it's not safe for you to be living alone." That night I lay awake in the guest room in my own house, and listened to them talking in the master bedroom. Their voices were muffled, but I caught enough words to understand. "Equity," Denise was saying. "Market value." "Power of attorney," Greg replied. "Competency evaluation." "I've been an engineer for 43 years. I know how to read blueprints, how to calculate load-bearing capacities, how to spot structural weaknesses before they become catastrophic failures." And lying there in the dark, I realized I was looking at the blueprint of my own destruction. The next morning I called my lawyer, Jim Patterson, who's been handling my affairs since Dorothy and I wrote our wills 20 years ago. "Jim," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. That living trust Dorothy and I set up, who has control of it?" "Well, Walter, since Dorothy passed, you're the sole trustee," Jim said. "The house, the investments, everything's in your name. Why do you ask?" That afternoon, while Greg and Denise were out looking at apartments, though I noticed they didn't take any paperwork with them, I went down to the basement and opened the safe Dorothy and I had installed behind the water heater. Inside, along with our important papers and a few pieces of her jewelry, I found the deed to the house. My name was on it. Only my name. I also found something else I'd forgotten about. A folder of stock certificates for Dover Construction, Earl's company. Dorothy and I had invested in it when Earl was just getting started, back in the 70s. I'd forgotten all about those shares, but looking at them now I realized they might be worth more than I'd thought. I felt something loosen in my chest. "Just making sure I understand my options," I said. That evening, Greg came home with a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad, I've got some great news," he said. "Denise and I found a place. We'll be moving out at the end of the month." But as I watched him pour the wine, I noticed his hands shaking slightly, and when Denise came in from the living room I saw her quickly stuff something into her purse. Something that looked like a real estate brochure. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "That's wonderful, son," I said. "I'm happy for you." That night I heard them on the phone with someone. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," Denise was saying. "We'll have the power of attorney signed by next week. Then we can move forward with the listing." I sat in my chair. Dorothy's chair, really, the one she'd love to read in by the window, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not even anger. Purpose. At 81 years old I was about to learn that some lessons come late in life. And some of them come with a price that's higher than you ever imagined you'd have to pay. Later never came, and I realized that in my own house I had just become a prisoner. The next morning I woke up to find the alarm system had been changed. The code I'd used for 15 years no longer worked. When I asked Greg about it, he just shrugged. "Security company recommended we update it," he said. "I'll get you the new code later." 3 days after they changed my alarm code, I found myself locked out of my own house. Completely locked out. Not just from certain rooms, but from the entire place I'd called home for 53 years. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I'd gone for my usual walk down to Miller's Hardware to check on some putty I'd ordered for the window frames. At my age you don't move as fast as you used to, but I still like to keep busy, keep the house in good repair. Dorothy always said idle hands were the devil's workshop, and even 2 years after losing her, I could hear her voice pushing me to stay active. Miller's Hardware has been in the same family for 4 generations. Tom Miller knows everyone in Dover Springs, and he's always got time for a chat about the weather or the high school football team. We spent a good hour talking about the renovations going on at the old elementary school, and Tom asked me to take a look at some blueprints the city was considering for the new library addition. "Walter, you built half this town," Tom said, rolling out the plans on his counter. "These young architects don't understand how to build for Ohio weather. Look at this foundation design, it'll crack within 5 years." I was flattered. He still valued my opinion. After 43 years as a civil engineer, I knew he was right about that foundation. We spent another half hour going over the structural concerns, and I promised to write up a proper assessment for the city council. By the time I walked back home, it was nearly noon. The autumn air was crisp, and I was feeling pretty good about myself. At 81, I might not be able to climb ladders anymore, but my mind was still sharp. I still had value, still had something to contribute. That good feeling lasted right up until I tried to open my front door. The key wouldn't turn. I tried it 3 times, thinking maybe I was just fumbling with it, but nothing. I walked around to the back door. Same problem. Even the side door to the basement was locked tight, and that door hadn't been locked since 1985. I stood there on my own front porch, looking at the house I'd built with my own hands, and felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a boy: complete helplessness. I knocked on the door, politely at first. Then more insistently. I could hear the television on inside, could hear Denise's voice talking to someone on the phone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Denise came to the door. She opened it just wide enough to stick her head out like I was some kind of salesman she was trying to get rid of. "Walter, there you are," she said. But her voice didn't sound relieved. It sounded annoyed. "We were wondering where you'd gotten to." "I went to Miller's Hardware," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why is the door locked? My key doesn't work." Denise sighed, like I was being difficult. "Greg had the locks changed this morning. We've been having some problems with break-ins in the neighborhood, and we thought it would be safer." Break-ins. In Dover Springs, where the biggest crime in the past 5 years was when teenagers toilet papered the Methodist church. "Well, can I have a new key?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach turn pity. And something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Walter, we need to talk," she said. "Come inside." I followed her into my own living room, where Greg was sitting on the couch with a stack of papers in his lap. He looked up when I came in, and I saw that same expression on his face that I'd seen on Denise's, like they were about to tell a child something difficult. "Dad, sit down," Greg said, patting the cushion next to him. "We've been doing some thinking, and we're concerned about you." Concerned about me? I looked around the room that Dorothy and I had furnished together, at the family photos on the mantel, at the Afghan she'd crocheted, draped over the back of her favorite chair. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. "What kind of concerns?" I asked. Denise sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap like a school counselor about to deliver bad news. "Walter, honey, we know this is hard to hear, but we think you might be having some memory problems." Memory problems. I thought about the conversation I'd just had with Tom Miller, about the structural analysis I'd done on the library plans, about the detailed calculations I'd worked out in my head for the foundation concerns. Memory problems. "I don't have memory problems," I said quietly. "Dad, you left the stove on yesterday," Greg said. "And last week you couldn't remember where you put your reading glasses. They were on your head." I stared at him. "I've been putting my reading glasses on my head for 30 years. Your mother used to tease me about it. And I left the stove on once for maybe 5 minutes while I went to get the mail." "It's not just that," Denise said, her voice taking on that gentle, patronizing tone people use when they're talking to someone they think is senile. "You've been getting confused about dates, asking the same questions over and over. Yesterday you asked me 3 times what day it was." That was a lie. I knew it was a lie. And they knew it was a lie. But sitting there in my own living room, with my own son looking at me like I was losing my mind, I felt something crack inside my chest. "What are you trying to say?" I asked. Greg reached over and put his hand on my arm. Dad, we think it would be best if you got some professional care. We've been looking at some really nice places, and we found one that we think you'd be comfortable in. Professional care. Nice places. I looked at the papers in Greg's lap and saw the letterhead, Maple Ridge Assisted Living. Below that I could see what looked like admission forms. You want to put me in a nursing home? I said. It's not a nursing home, Dad. It's assisted living. Very different. They have activities and meal service, and there's a nurse on staff 24 hours a day. You'd have your own room, your own bathroom. You'd be safe. Safe. I thought about the 43 years I'd spent designing bridges and buildings, calculating stress loads and safety factors. I thought about the volunteer fire department, where I'd served as chief for 12 years, running into burning buildings to save people. I thought about the storm cellar I'd built in this house, and how Dorothy and I had weathered 3 tornadoes in it over the years. Safe. What about the house? I asked. Greg and Denise exchanged a look. Well, Dad will take care of everything. You don't need to worry about any of that. They had it all planned out. Had probably been planning it for months. The changed locks, the forged concerns about my memory, the assisted living brochures. They were going to warehouse me somewhere so they could take over my life. I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball and change a tire and treat people with respect. And I saw a stranger who was calmly explaining to me why I needed to be removed from my own life. When? I asked. Well, we were thinking maybe this weekend, Denise said. We've already talked to the people at Maple Ridge, and they have a room available. We could help you pack some things. Just the essentials. The rest we'll take care of. This weekend, in 4 days, I would be living in a room that wasn't mine, eating food I didn't choose, following a schedule someone else set for me. And my house, Dorothy's house, the house where we'd raised our son and built our life, would belong to 2 people who were looking at me like I was already dead. I see, I said. And I did see. I saw everything more clearly than I had in months. I saw the careful way they'd isolated me, the gradual erosion of my independence, the calculated steps they'd taken to make this moment inevitable. I saw the future they'd planned for me and the future they'd planned for themselves. What they didn't see was the man sitting across from them, the man who'd built half of Dover Springs, who'd run into burning buildings, who'd survived the great blizzard of '78 and the flood of '85. The man who still had his wits about him and his dignity and a few tricks they didn't know about. All right, I said. If that's what you think is best. They looked relieved. Greg actually smiled like we'd just worked out a minor scheduling conflict. Dad, you're doing the right thing, he said. You'll see, this is going to be good for everyone. I nodded and went to my room, the guest room in my own house, to pack. But as I folded my clothes and gathered my few remaining possessions, I wasn't thinking about assisted living or meal service or 24-hour nursing care. I was thinking about property deeds, and stock certificates, and the phone number for Jim Patterson, my lawyer. Because at 81 years old I was about to get an education in exactly what I was capable of when someone tried to take everything away from me. That night I made a phone call from the landline in the basement, the one they'd forgotten about. By morning I had an appointment with someone who was very interested in my story. Greg and Denise had no idea what they'd just started. Maple Ridge Assisted Living sits on the outskirts of Dover Springs like a beige monument to giving up. When Greg and Denise drove me there that Saturday morning, I looked up at the building and felt something inside me go cold. Not fear. I'd moved past fear sometime during the sleepless night before. What I felt was a kind of crystalline clarity I hadn't experienced since my engineering days, when I'd spot a fatal flaw in a blueprint and know exactly how to fix it. The intake process was humiliating in a way I hadn't expected. A woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, pleasant enough but clearly overworked, sat across from me with a clipboard and asked questions like I was applying for a driver's license renewal instead of being shipped off to what everyone was politely calling my new home. "Any history of wandering, Mr. Granger?" she asked, her pen poised over the form. Wandering, like I was some kind of lost dog. "No," I said. "Any concerns about medication management?" I looked at Greg, who was sitting beside me like he was my legal guardian instead of my son. "I've been managing my own medications just fine for 81 years. Dad, remember what Dr. Phillips said about your blood pressure pills?" Greg said, giving Mrs. Rodriguez a meaningful look. "Sometimes you forget to take them." That was another lie. I'd been taking the same medication at the same time every morning for 6 years. Ever since Dorothy's death sent my blood pressure through the roof. I had a pill organizer, a routine, a system that worked. But sitting there in that sterile office, I realized that the truth didn't matter anymore. They'd already decided what version of Walter Granger they needed me to be. My room was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot. It was clean. I'll give them that. Clean and small and beige, with a hospital bed and a television and a little bathroom with grab bars everywhere. There was a window, but it didn't open for fire safety, they said. Greg and Denise helped me unpack my few belongings, making bright conversation about how nice everything was, how comfortable I'd be, how this was really the best thing for everyone. When they left, Denise kissed my cheek and Greg shook my hand, and I watched them walk away down the hallway like they were heading off to vacation. The first week was rough. Meals at set times, activities at set times, lights out at set times. I felt like I was back in the army, except this time I was too old to rebel and too tired to fight. The other residents were friendly enough, but most of them were in various stages of decline that I wasn't ready to accept for myself. There was one bright spot, though. A young woman named Clara Martinez worked the evening shift, and she treated me like I was still a human being instead of a warehouse inventory item. Clara was putting herself through nursing school, and she had a curiosity about people that reminded me of Dorothy when she was young. "Mr. Granger," she said one evening, while helping me with my blood pressure medication, "my grandmother always said you could tell a lot about a person by looking at their hands. You have builder's hands." I looked down at my hands, scarred and spotted with age, but still strong. "I was a civil engineer," I said. "Built bridges, designed buildings, even built my own house." Clara's eyes lit up. "Really? That's amazing. I bet you have some incredible stories." Nobody had asked me about my stories in a long time. Not Greg, not Denise, not any of the other staff members who saw me as just another old man taking up space. But Clara listened, really listened, when I told her about the covered bridge I'd helped restore in 1987, or the time I'd had to redesign the foundation for the new post office, because the original contractor had ignored soil conditions. "You know, Mr. Granger," Clara said one night about 2 weeks into my stay, "I have a cousin who's a lawyer. Real estate law mostly. He's always talking about how older folks sometimes get taken advantage of by family members. You ever worry about anything like that?" I looked at her carefully. Clara was 26 years old, but she had an old soul and sharp eyes. "Just seems to me like someone with your knowledge and experience wouldn't end up in a place like this unless something wasn't right. Not that there's anything wrong with Maple Ridge," she added quickly. "But you're not like the other residents. You're sharp, you're independent, you're healthy. Makes me wonder what the real story is." That night I lay in my narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. The truth was, I'd been wondering the same thing. Greg had visited exactly once since dropping me off, and that visit had lasted all of 20 minutes. Denise hadn't come at all. When I tried to call the house, the number had been disconnected. The next morning I asked Clara if she could help me with something. "I need to check on some things online," I said. "Legal documents, that sort of thing." Clara's expression grew serious. "Mr. Granger, you don't have to tell me what's going on, but if you need help, I'm here. My cousin Ben, the lawyer I mentioned, he's good people. He's helped a lot of families with complicated situations." An hour later I was sitting in the facility's computer room, which was really just a corner of the activity area with 2 ancient desktop computers that took 10 minutes to boot up. Clara sat beside me showing me how to navigate the internet, and within minutes I was looking at something that made my blood run cold. There it was, On the Dover Springs Real Estate Association website, 1247 Maple Street, Dover Springs, Ohio. My address. My house. Listed for $925,000. The description read, charming Victorian home, fully renovated, original hardwood floors, updated kitchen, mature landscaping, sellers motivated, quick closing preferred. Sellers motivated. I stared at the screen and something hot and sharp rose in my chest. Not anger. That was too small a word for what I felt. This was rage. Pure and clean and focused like a laser beam. Mr. Granger? Clara's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you okay? I scrolled down to see more details. The listing agent was someone named Patricia Hoskins from Pinnacle Realty. The property was described as estate sale and family relocating. Under seller information, I saw something that made my hands shake. Power of attorney Gregory Granger. Clara, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, I need to call your cousin right now. She looked at the screen, then at me. Mr. Granger, is that your house? Yes, I said. And according to this, my son is selling it without my permission. Clara's face went white. But that's theft. That's fraud. I nodded. That's exactly what it is. And I need to stop it. Within an hour, Ben Chavez was sitting across from me in Maple Ridge's family conference room. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes, and the sort of careful attention that good lawyers develop when they're listening to someone's story. Mr. Granger, he said, after I'd explained everything, I need to ask you some direct questions. Do you have any cognitive impairment? Any diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's? No, I said. I've had a physical every year for the past decade. Dr. Phillips has never suggested anything like that. Good. Do you have any legal documents giving your son power of attorney? No. Dorothy and I discussed it years ago, but we never signed anything. We didn't trust anyone that much. Ben made notes. So if your son is claiming power of attorney, he's either forged documents or he's lying to the real estate agent. Both, I'd guess. Ben leaned back in his chair. Mr. Granger, I'm going to be straight with you. This is a serious situation. If your son is attempting to sell your property without legal authority, that's fraud. But we need to act quickly. Real estate transactions can move fast, especially if someone's motivated to close quickly. What do you need from me? First, I need copies of all your legal documents. Property deed, will, any trusts. Second, I need to file an immediate injunction to stop the sale. Third, we need to document your mental competency, so there's no question about your ability to make your own decisions. I thought about the safe in my basement, about the documents I'd looked at weeks ago when I first started suspecting something was wrong. The papers are in my house, in a safe. Can you get access to them? I looked at Clara, who'd been sitting quietly through the entire conversation. I think I know someone who can help with that. That afternoon, while Greg and Denise were at their respective jobs, Clara and I took an unauthorized trip to 1247 Maple Street. I still had my key to the back door, the one they'd forgotten about. And within minutes I was back in the house I'd built with my own hands. It was like walking through a museum of my own life. Everything was arranged perfectly like a showroom. Dorothy's quilts were gone, replaced by generic throws. Her garden was overgrown, the roses she'd tended for 30 years dying from neglect. In the kitchen they'd removed the photo magnets from the refrigerator. Pictures of grandchildren we'd never had, of Christmases and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday nights that had meant everything to us. But the safe was still there, hidden behind the water heater where I'd installed it in 1975. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The deed, the will, the stock certificates for Dover Construction, Dorothy's jewelry, and a few other documents I'd forgotten about, including the original life insurance policy that had made me wealthy enough to build this house in the first place. I handed the deed to Clara, who photographed it with her phone. Mr. Granger, she said, this is all in your name only. I know, I said. Dorothy and I were old-fashioned about some things. We figured one of us should legally own the house, and since I was the one with the steady income, it made sense for it to be me. So Greg has no legal claim to this property at all. None whatsoever. Clara smiled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was looking at the future instead of the past. That evening, Ben called me with news. "Mr. Granger, I filed the injunction. The sale is stopped as of this afternoon. I've also sent a cease and desist letter to your son and the real estate agent. But I have to warn you, this is going to get ugly." "How ugly?" "Your son is going to claim you're incompetent. He's going to say you're confused, that you don't understand what's happening. He might even try to get you committed." I thought about Greg's face when he'd explained why I needed to be in assisted living, about Denise's patronizing voice when she talked about my memory problems. "Ben," I said, "I've been building things for 70 years. I know how to tear them down too." The next morning I woke up with a plan. Not just to stop the sale of my house, but to make sure that Greg and Denise never had the chance to do this to anyone else. At 81 years old, I was about to show them what a real motivated seller looked like. The thing about being a civil engineer for 43 years is that you learn to think in system. You don't just build a bridge, you analyze the terrain, calculate the stress loads, account for weather patterns and soil conditions, and 100 other variables that could bring the whole thing down. And when someone tries to destroy something you've built, you don't react emotionally. You plan. 3 days after Ben filed the injunction, I was sitting in Maple Ridge's activity room with a yellow legal pad, sketching out what I'd come to think of as my liberation blueprint. Clara had brought me a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the dishwater they served in the dining hall, and was sitting across from me watching me work. "Mr. Granger," she said, "you look like you're designing a building." "In a way, I am," I said. "I'm designing my way out of this mess." The first priority was establishing my legal competency beyond any possible doubt. Ben had explained that Greg's best defense would be to claim I was mentally incapacitated, that I didn't understand what was happening, so I'd asked Clara to document everything: my daily activities, my conversations, my problem-solving abilities. She'd been keeping detailed notes for the past week, and the picture they painted was of a man who was sharp, engaged, and fully capable of making his own decisions. "Look at this," Clara said, showing me her notebook. "Yesterday you helped Mrs. Patterson balance her checkbook. The day before you fixed the wobbly chair in the TV room. This morning you walked Mr. Rodriguez through the steps for filing a Medicare claim. Does that sound like someone who's confused about reality?" I smiled. "Keep documenting, we're going to need every detail." The second priority was understanding exactly what Greg and Denise had done. Ben had been busy. He'd confirmed that the power of attorney documents Greg had presented to the real estate agent were forged. He'd also discovered that they'd been using my credit cards to pay for renovations to the house. Renovations that had increased the property value by nearly $100,000. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. "There's something else," Ben said during our phone call that afternoon. "I ran a background check on your daughter-in-law. She's got a history of financial problems. 3 credit cards in collections, a repossession on her record, and she was fired from her job at the bank for irregularities in customer accounts." I wasn't surprised. Denise had always been too interested in money for my comfort. When she and Greg first got married, she'd asked pointed questions about my retirement savings, my insurance policies, my investment portfolio. Dorothy had warned me about her, but I'd chalked it up to natural mother-in-law suspicion. Dorothy had been right, as usual. The third priority was the most important, making sure I had somewhere to go when I got out of Maple Ridge. I couldn't go back to the house, not right away. Greg and Denise were probably watching it, and I didn't want to give them any ammunition for their inevitable claim that I was unstable or dangerous. That's when I remembered Earl Tate. Earl and I had been friends since high school, and he'd built Dover Construction from a 2-man operation into the most successful contracting company in 3 counties. More importantly, Earl was the kind of man who understood loyalty, who remembered the people who'd helped him along the way. I'd invested in Dover Construction back in 1973, when Earl was struggling to get started. $5,000, which was a fortune for Dorothy and me at the time. Those stock certificates had been sitting in my safe for 50 years, and I'd honestly forgotten about them. But if Earl's company had grown the way I thought it had, those shares might be worth more than I'd imagined. "Clara," I said, "I need to make a phone call. A private one." She found me an empty office, and I dialed Earl's number from memory. He answered on the second ring, and his voice was exactly the same as it had been in high school, warm, gravelly, with just a hint of the Kentucky accent his family had brought north during the Depression. "Walter Granger," he said, like he'd been expecting my call. "I heard you were at Maple Ridge. Been meaning to come by and visit. Earl, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Those Dover Construction shares I bought back in '73, what are they worth now?" There was a pause. "Walter, are you asking because you need money, or because you're curious?" "I'm asking because I might need to liquidate some assets." "Jesus, Walter. Those shares have split 4 times since you bought them. You own about 2% of the company now. At current valuation, that's somewhere around $200,000. I felt something loosen in my chest. "Earl, I might need your help with something, and I might need it soon." "What kind of help?" I told him everything, about Greg and Denise, about the forged power of attorney, about the house listing, about my current situation at Maple Ridge. Earl listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence. "Those sons of bitches," he said finally. "Walter, you should have called me weeks ago. What do you need?" "Property evaluation, fast and confidential, and maybe some help finding a buyer." "You want to sell the house?" "I want to sell it before they can steal it." Earl chuckled, and I heard something in his voice that reminded me of the 18-year-old kid who talked his way into his first construction job. "Walter, you always were 3 steps ahead of everybody else. Yeah, I can help you. Give me 24 hours. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the house, about all the work Dorothy and I had put into it over the years. The kitchen we'd remodeled in 1987. The hardwood floors we'd refinished by hand. The garden she'd tended, the porch where we'd watched 50 summers come and go. It hurt to think about letting it go, but it hurt more to think about Greg and Denise profiting from our life's work. The next morning, Clara brought me disturbing news. "Mr. Granger, I heard from my cousin Ben, your son hired a lawyer. A big one from Columbus. They're planning to challenge your competency, and they're going to petition the court to have you declared unable to manage your own affairs." I nodded. I'd been expecting this. "How long do we have?" "Ben says maybe a week before they file. 2 weeks before a hearing." That afternoon, Earl called back. "Walter, I've got good news and better news. The good news is that your house is worth every penny of that $925,000 listing price. The better news is that I've got a cash buyer who's willing to pay full price and close in 10 days. "Who's the buyer?" "A developer from Columbus. He's been looking for property in Dover Springs for a boutique hotel project. Your house is perfect, historic, well-maintained, great location. He's ready to wire the money as soon as you sign the papers." I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. "Earl, can you handle the transaction? I don't want Greg and Denise to know about this until it's done." "Already on it. I know a title company in Zanesville that can handle the paperwork confidentially. You just need to sign the documents and provide the deed." The next step was updating my will. I'd been thinking about this for days, and I'd come to a decision that would have shocked the Walter Granger of 6 months ago. Greg had made his choice when he decided to steal my house and warehouse me in an assisted living facility. Now I was going to make mine. Ben helped me draft the new will. The house proceeds would go into a trust, with Clara as the primary beneficiary. She'd been kinder to me in 3 weeks than my own son had been in 3 years. Her daughter would get a college fund. The local library would get a substantial donation. Dover Construction would get my stock back, with instructions to use the dividend income for a scholarship fund. Greg would get nothing. Not the house, not the savings, not the life insurance, nothing. Mr. Granger, Ben said when I signed the documents, "Are you sure about this? It's a big step." Ben, I've been building things my whole life. I know the difference between a solid foundation and a house of cards. Greg and Denise built their plans on fraud and betrayal. I'm building mine on legal documents and legitimate transactions. That evening, I called Earl one more time. "Earl, I'm ready to move forward. How quickly can we close?" "The buyer's money is already in escrow. We can close Friday if you can get to the title company." "I'll be there." Clara was working her shift when I told her about the plan. Her eyes went wide when I explained what I was doing and what it meant for her and her daughter. "Mr. Granger, I can't accept this, it's too much." "Clara, you treated me like a human being when everyone else treated me like a burden. You listened to my stories. You helped me fight for my rights. You gave me hope when I didn't have any. That's worth more than money." She was crying now, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Dorothy died, the satisfaction of taking care of someone who deserved it. Friday morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. In 6 hours, I would own nothing but my clothes and my dignity. But I would also be free of the two people who'd tried to steal my life. At 81 years old, I was about to learn that sometimes the best revenge is living well. But first, I had a house to sell. The Zanesville Title Company sits in a converted Victorian mansion on Main Street, the kind of place that makes you think about permanence and tradition, which seemed fitting, considering I was about to permanently alter the trajectory of my family story. Clara had driven me there in her little Honda, taking a personal day from Maple Ridge to help me with what she called the most important transaction of your life. She wasn't wrong. At 81 years old, I was about to sell the house I'd built with my own hands, the house where Dorothy and I had shared 53 years of marriage, the house where we'd raised our son. The house that son was planning to steal from me. Earl was waiting for us in the lobby, looking every inch the successful businessman he'd become. Hard to believe this was the same kid who'd borrowed my calculus notes in high school and paid me back with a case of beer. He stood up when he saw me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd missed for too long: respect. "Walter," he said, gripping my hand. "You sure about this?" Never been more sure of anything in my life. The closing took exactly 43 minutes. I signed my name 17 times, watched the notary stamp her seal on documents that transferred ownership of my life's work to a stranger, and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. When the title agent handed me the cashier's check for $925,000, I stared at it for a long moment. It was a lot of money, more than Dorothy and I had ever imagined we'd have. But it was also just paper. What mattered was what it represented: my freedom, my independence, my ability to make my own choices about my own life. "Mr. Granger," the title agent said, "congratulations. The property will be transferred to the new owner effective immediately. You'll need to arrange for the removal of any personal property within 30 days. I smiled. "I don't think that's going to be a problem." On the drive back to Dover Springs, Clara asked the question I'd been dreading: "Mr. Granger, what happens now? I mean, with your son and his wife?" I looked out the window at the familiar landscape, the farms and forests I'd driven past for decades. Now they find out what it feels like to have someone else make decisions about their lives. The eviction notice was delivered at 2:17 p.m. that same afternoon. I know the exact time because Earl had arranged for a process server to document everything. Greg and Denise were both home, probably planning their next move in what they thought was their house. According to the process server's report, which Earl shared with me later, Denise answered the door. She looked at the official documents, read the first paragraph, and started screaming. Greg came running from the kitchen, took one look at the papers, and turned white as a sheet. "This is impossible," he told the process server. "My father doesn't own this house anymore. He's not competent to make these kinds of decisions." The process server. A woman named Janet Morrison, who'd been doing this job for 15 years, looked at him with the kind of patience that comes from dealing with people in denial. "Sir, according to the county records, Walter Granger was the sole owner of this property as of this morning. As of this afternoon, the property belongs to Columbus Development Group. You have 72 hours to vacate." That evening my phone rang. I was sitting in Maple Ridge's family room playing chess with another resident, when Clara brought me the cordless phone from the nurse's station. "Dad?" Greg's voice was shaking. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" I moved my queen to check his king. "Hello, Greg. I understand you received some paperwork today." "Paperwork? Dad, we got evicted. From your house. The house we've been living in, the house we've been taking care of for you." Taking care of. I thought about the locks they changed, the alarm code they kept from me, the way they locked me out of my own home. "Greg, it's not my house anymore." "What do you mean it's not your house?" "Of course it's your house. I sold it." There was a long silence. "Then you sold it." "Dad, you can't sell it. You don't have the authority to." "I don't have the authority. Greg, I built that house. I paid for it. My name was on the deed. I had every right to sell it." "But Dad, you're in assisted living. You have memory problems. You can't make decisions like this." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Memory problems. "Greg, I remember everything. I remember you changing the locks on my house. I remember you putting me in this place against my will. I remember you forging power of attorney documents to try to steal my property." Another silence. Then in a voice I barely recognized, "Dad, I don't know what you think you remember, but I know exactly what I remember. And I know exactly what I'm doing. This is insane. You can't just sell our house without telling us." "It was never your house, Greg. It was my house. And now it's gone." I hung up the phone and went back to my chess game. Checkmate in 3 moves. The next morning brought more drama. According to Clara, who'd heard it from her cousin Ben, Denise had shown up at the Dover Springs Police Department, demanding they arrest me for fraud. She'd brought a stack of paperwork including the forged power of attorney documents, and insisted that I was mentally incompetent and had no right to sell the house. Officer Mike Rodriguez, no relation to Mrs. Rodriguez from the assisted living intake, had listened patiently to her story, then made a few phone calls to the title company. To Ben Chavez, to Dr. Phillips, who'd been my physician for 12 years. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez had told her, "I've confirmed that Mr. Granger is legally competent, that he was the sole owner of the property, and that the sale was completely legitimate. What's not legitimate is this power of attorney document you've presented. It's a forgery, and that's a felony." Denise had left the police station in tears, but not before being informed that she was under investigation for fraud. The eviction proceeded on schedule. Earl had arranged for a moving company to remove Greg and Denise's belongings and place them in storage. The cost would be deducted from the deposit they'd never paid, which meant it would come out of their own pockets. I found myself thinking about Dorothy during those 3 days. She'd always been the practical one in our marriage, the one who could see through people's motives and call things by their proper names. She'd warned me about Denise from the beginning, but I'd dismissed her concerns as maternal jealousy. "She's after something, Walter." Dorothy had said after Greg and Denise's engagement party, "That girl's got $signs in her eyes." I should have listened to her. I should have protected us both better. But Dorothy was gone, and I was still here, and I was finally doing what she would have wanted me to do, standing up for myself. On Monday afternoon, Clara brought me a newspaper clipping from the Dover Springs Gazette. The headline read, "Local Man Outsmarts Family in Property Dispute." The article was brief but accurate, focusing on the legal aspects of the case and the importance of elder rights. "Mr. Granger," Clara said, "you're famous." I looked at the article, at the photo of my house, my former house, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Pride. Not in the revenge exactly, but in the fact that I'd refused to be victimized. I'd used my intelligence, my resources, and my legal rights to protect myself. That evening, Greg called again. This time his voice was different, smaller, desperate. "Dad, we need to talk. Face to face. Please." "We are talking, Greg." "No. I mean really talk, about what happened, about what we're going to do now. Dad, we don't have anywhere to live, we don't have any money, we've got nowhere to go." I thought about that for a moment. About the two people who tried to steal my house, who'd locked me out of my own home, who'd put me in assisted living against my will. About the way they talked about me like I was already dead. "Greg," I said finally, "you should have thought about that before you decided to steal from me. Dad, please, we're family." Family. I looked around the common room at Maple Ridge, at the other residents watching television or playing cards or staring out the windows. Most of them had family too. Family who visited once a month or once a year or not at all. Family who'd made the same calculations Greg and Denise had made, weighing the inconvenience of elder care against the value of inheritance. "Greg," I said, "family doesn't steal from family. Family doesn't lie to family. Family doesn't put family in institutions against their will. Dad, we were trying to help you. You thought you could take everything I'd worked for, and I'd be too old and too confused to stop you." I hung up again. This time I didn't feel cold. I felt warm, like I was sitting in front of the fireplace Dorothy and I had shared for so many years. The next morning I woke up to find that Greg and Denise had moved out overnight. The house was empty, ready for its new owners. And I was ready for whatever came next. At 81 years old, I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting free. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same process server who'd evicted Greg and Denise from my house. Janet Morrison had become something of a regular visitor to Maple Ridge, and she greeted me with the professional sympathy of someone who'd seen too many family disputes turn ugly. "Mr. Granger," she said, handing me the thick manila envelope, "your son's filed a competency petition. Court date is set for next Monday at 9 a.m. I wasn't surprised. Ben Chavez had warned me this was coming. What did surprise me was how calm I felt about it. 6 months ago, the thought of my own son trying to have me declared mentally incompetent would have devastated me. Now it just seemed like the next logical step in a chess game I was already winning. The petition was professionally written, probably by that expensive Columbus lawyer Greg had hired. It painted a picture of a confused old man making irrational decisions, selling his house impulsively, being manipulated by outside influences, meaning Clara and Ben, I assumed. According to the document, I was a danger to myself and others, incapable of managing my own affairs, and in need of immediate court protection. It was a masterwork of legal fiction, and it might have been convincing if it hadn't been so completely untrue. Clara found me in the family room that afternoon, reviewing the petition with the same attention I'd once given to blueprint specifications. She sat down beside me and read over my shoulder, her expression growing darker with each page. "Mr. Granger, this is character assassination. They're making you sound like you're in the late stages of dementia." "I know," I said. "The question is, can we prove they're lying?" "Can we prove it? Mr. Granger, I've been documenting everything you've done for the past month. You've helped 3 residents with their financial planning, fixed 2 broken appliances, and provided structural advice for the new wheelchair ramp. Yesterday you spent 4 hours helping the activities director redesign the layout of the craft room for better accessibility." I smiled. "Keep talking. You remember every conversation we've had, every detail of your past, every step of your legal strategy. You've managed a complex real estate transaction that most people half your age couldn't handle. If you're incompetent, then I'm the Queen of England." That evening, Ben called to discuss our strategy. "Walter, I've been thinking about this case, and I believe we have a few advantages they don't know about. Such as, first, Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to our process server, has a reputation for being tough on elder abuse cases. She's seen too many families trying to steal from their elderly relatives, and she doesn't have much patience for it. Good to know. Second, I've been in touch with Dr. Phillips. He's willing to testify that you've never shown any signs of cognitive decline. In fact, he says you're one of the sharpest patients he has. Even better. Third, we have Clara's documentation. 3 weeks of detailed observations showing that you're fully functional, mentally alert, and capable of complex reasoning. That's going to be hard for them to counter. I felt something settle in my chest. Ben, what's our biggest risk? Honestly, public perception. If this gets media attention, it could get ugly. Family disputes always do. But I think we're on solid ground legally. The media attention Ben was worried about materialized the next morning. I was having breakfast in the Maple Ridge dining room when Mrs. Rodriguez approached with a worried expression. "Mr. Granger, there's a reporter from the Dover Springs Gazette here to see you. And, well, there's also a television crew from Columbus." I looked out the window and saw a Channel 6 news van parked in the lot. Standing next to it was a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a microphone, talking to a camera operator. "What do they want?" I asked. "They want to interview you about your family dispute. The reporter says it's become a story about elder rights and family fraud." Clara, who'd been sitting across from me, leaned forward. "Mr. Granger, you don't have to talk to them. You could just ignore this." I thought about that for a moment, about staying quiet, keeping my head down, letting Greg and Denise control the narrative, about the dozens of other elderly people who'd been victimized by their own families and never had the resources or support to fight back. "No," I said. "I think it's time people heard the truth." The interview took place in Maple Ridge's family conference room. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Chen, had done her homework. She knew about the forged power of attorney, the attempted house sale, the eviction. She also knew about my background, my career, my reputation in the community. "Mr. Granger," she said, "your son claims you're suffering from dementia and that you sold your house in a moment of confusion. How do you respond to that?" I looked directly into the camera. I respond by saying that I'm 81 years old, not 81 years stupid. I've been a civil engineer for 43 years. I've designed bridges that are still standing, buildings that are still in use. I know the difference between a sound structure and a house of cards. And what my son built was a house of cards. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" "I mean that his entire plan was based on fraud. Forged documents, false claims about my mental state, attempts to steal property that was never his. That's not the behavior of someone who's concerned about his father's welfare. That's the behavior of someone who's more interested in inheritance than family." The interview ran on the evening news and was picked up by the Columbus stations. By the next morning it had gone viral on social media. My phone started ringing with calls from other news outlets, advocacy groups, and elderly people who'd gone through similar situations. The story that emerged in the following days was more complex than I'd expected. It turned out that Denise had been fired from her job at Dover Springs Community Bank, not for irregularities, but for embezzling money from elderly customers' accounts. She'd been targeting people in their 70s and 80s, making small withdrawals that many of them didn't notice. When the bank discovered the theft, they'd given her the choice between prosecution and resignation. She'd chosen resignation, but the story had gotten around. That's why she and Greg had been behind on their mortgage. No one in town would hire her after that. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family dispute, it was a pattern of elder abuse. The district attorney's office opened an investigation. The bank was facing questions about why they'd covered up the theft instead of reporting it. And Greg and Denise were facing the possibility of criminal charges. On Friday morning, 3 days before the competency hearing, I got a call from Greg. His voice was different again. Not angry this time, but defeated. "Dad, can we please talk? Just you and me?" "We're talking now, Greg." "No, I mean in person. Please. I need to explain some things." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him in Maple Ridge's family room. Clara insisted on being present, and Ben joined us by phone. I wanted witnesses to whatever Greg had to say. When Greg walked into the room, I barely recognized him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "Dad," he said, sitting down across from me, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I waited. At 81, I'd learned the value of letting people fill their own silences. "I didn't know about Denise," he continued. "About the bank, about the money she stole. I swear to you I didn't know. But you knew about the forged power of attorney." He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "She said it was just a formality, that we needed it to help you manage your affairs. She said all families did it. And you believed her?" I wanted to believe her. "Dad, we were drowning. The mortgage, the credit cards, her job situation. When she said we could live in your house, help you take care of it, maybe eventually inherit it. It seemed like the answer to our problems." I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and drive a car and be a man, and saw someone I didn't recognize. Someone who'd been willing to steal from his own father to solve his financial problems. "Greg," I said finally, "do you understand what you did to me?" He started crying. Then, not the angry tears of a frustrated man, but the broken sobs of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of his betrayal. "I know," he said. "I know what we did, and I know I can't undo it. But Dad, please, can you find it in your heart to forgive me? Can we find a way to move forward?" I thought about that question for a long time. About forgiveness, about family, about the difference between justice and revenge, about Dorothy, and what she would have wanted me to do. "Greg," I said finally, "forgiveness isn't something you can ask for. It's something you have to earn, and you've got a long way to go." He nodded, wiping his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to drop the competency petition. I want you to cooperate with the district attorney's investigation. I want you to get your wife the help she needs, and I want you to stay away from me until you figure out who you want to be." Greg left that afternoon, and I didn't hear from him again before the court date. But on Monday morning, when I arrived at the courthouse with Clara and Ben, I found that the competency petition had been withdrawn. Standing on the courthouse steps, facing the cameras and reporters, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: vindication. Not just personal vindication, but something larger. I'd stood up for myself, and in doing so, I'd stood up for every elderly person who'd been victimized by their own families. At 81 years old, I'd learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for your family is to refuse to be their victim. There's something liberating about writing a letter you don't intend to send. I discovered this on a Wednesday evening in November, sitting in my room at Maple Ridge with a yellow legal pad and a pen I'd borrowed from Clara. The letter was to Greg, and it contained every word I'd wanted to say to him for the past 6 months. I wrote about the day he was born, when Dorothy and I held him for the first time and made promises about the kind of parents we'd be. I wrote about teaching him to throw a baseball in the backyard, about helping him with his homework at the kitchen table, about the pride I'd felt when he graduated from high school and headed off to college. I wrote about the man I'd hoped he'd become, and the man he'd actually become instead. But mostly, I wrote about letting go. It had been 3 weeks since Greg's breakdown in the family room, 3 weeks since the competency hearing had been canceled, 3 weeks since the media attention had died down. In that time, I'd been doing something I hadn't done in years: making plans for my own future. The house money was sitting in a high-yield savings account, earning more in interest each month than I'd ever made in salary. Earl had helped me set up a trust fund for Clara's daughter, Maria, who was 15 and dreaming of becoming a veterinarian. The Dover Springs Public Library had received a donation large enough to fund their new wing, and I'd established a scholarship fund at the local community college for students studying skilled trades. But the most important thing I'd done was make a decision about where I wanted to spend whatever years I had left. Maple Ridge wasn't a bad place. The staff was kind, the food was decent, and I'd made a few friends among the other residents. But it wasn't home. It wasn't where I belonged, and at 81, I was tired of living in places that weren't mine. That's when I remembered Asheville. Dorothy and I had visited Asheville, North Carolina during our honeymoon in 1962. We'd stayed at a little bed and breakfast in the mountains, spent our days hiking and our evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and purple. We'd promised each other we'd go back someday. Maybe when we retired. Someday had never come. There was always something else. Work, family obligations, the daily business of living. But sitting in my room at Maple Ridge, writing a letter to a son who'd betrayed me, I realized that someday was now. I'd been in touch with a real estate agent in Asheville, a woman named Sarah Mitchell who specialized in helping retirees relocate to the mountains. She'd sent me information about several properties, small houses, condos, even a few apartments, all within my budget and all designed for independent living. The one that caught my attention was a two-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town, with a view of the mountains and a workshop in the basement. The current owner was a retired carpenter who'd built custom furniture for 40 years. He was moving to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren, and he wanted to sell to someone who'd appreciate the craftsmanship he'd put into the place. I called him that evening and we talked for an hour about woodworking, about building things to last, about the satisfaction of creating something with your hands. His name was Frank Morrison, and he reminded me of myself at his age, proud of his work, devoted to his craft, ready to pass on what he'd learned to the next generation. "Mr. Granger," he said, "I've had a dozen people look at this place. Most of them want to tear out the workshop and turn it into a family room. But you sound like someone who understands what it means to build something worth keeping." I made an offer that night. Cash. No contingencies. Closing whenever he was ready. Frank accepted immediately, and we scheduled the closing for the following week. The hardest part was telling Clara. She'd become more than just a nurse to me. She'd become a friend, a confidant, a daughter I'd never had. The thought of leaving her behind was almost enough to make me reconsider the whole plan. "Mr. Granger," she said, when I told her about Asheville, "I'm going to miss you so much, but I'm also so proud of you. You're not just surviving what happened with your son, you're living again." We were sitting in the family room and I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. She opened it and found a key, the key to a safe deposit box at Dover Springs Community Bank. "Mr. Granger, what is this?" "It's Maria's college fund. There's enough in there to cover 4 years of veterinary school plus living expenses. I want her to have every opportunity to follow her dreams." Clara started crying, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Dorothy died, the deep satisfaction of taking care of someone who deserved it. "I can't accept this," she said. "It's too much. Clara, you gave me back my dignity when everyone else was trying to take it away. You listened to my stories. You helped me fight for my rights. You treated me like a human being when my own family treated me like a burden. That's worth more than money." The next morning, I finished the letter to Greg. But instead of filing it away, I decided to send it. Not because I expected a response, but because I needed to say goodbye to the relationship we'd never had, and the future we'd never share. The letter was shorter than I'd planned and more direct. "Greg, I'm leaving Ohio. I'm moving to North Carolina to start a new life, away from the pain and betrayal of the past few months. I want you to know that I don't hate you. I pity you. You had a father who loved you, a mother who adored you, and a family that would have supported you through any crisis. Instead, you chose to steal from me, lie to me, and try to warehouse me in a place I didn't want to be. You chose money over family, and in doing so you lost both. I hope someday you figure out what really matters in life, but I won't be waiting around to see if you do. This is goodbye, son. I wish it could have been different." I mailed the letter on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon I was in Frank Morrison's cottage, signing the final papers and accepting the keys to my new home. That evening I stood on the porch of my new house, looking out at the Blue Ridge Mountains, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. I thought about Dorothy, about the promises we'd made to each other on our honeymoon, about the life we'd built together and the life I was building now. I thought about Greg, about the man he'd become and the man he might have been, and I thought about the future, my future, and all the possibilities it held. At 81 years old, I was learning that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose your own path, and it's never too late to refuse to be anyone's victim. The mountains were beautiful in the fading light, and I had nowhere else to be. For the first time in months, I was exactly where I belonged. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, with my own key in my own pocket, and I realized that this was what freedom felt like. I had no idea what Greg did with the letter, or if he even read it, but it didn't matter. I'd said what I needed to say, and I was ready to move forward. At 81, I was finally free to be the man I'd always been, instead of the burden someone else wanted me to become. The Blue Ridge Mountains have a way of putting things in perspective. I discovered this on my first morning in Asheville, standing on the porch of my new cottage with a cup of coffee and a view that stretched for miles. At 81, I'd lived through a lot of sunrises, but this one felt different. It felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. The cottage was exactly what I'd hoped for. Frank Morrison had built it with the attention to detail that comes from 40 years of craftsmanship. The floors were solid oak, hand-finished. The kitchen cabinets were maple, with dovetail joints that would last a century. The workshop in the basement was a woodworker's dream, organized, well-lit, equipped with tools that had been maintained with the care of someone who understood their value. Frank had left me a note on the kitchen counter. "Walter, I hope you find as much happiness in this place as I have. The workshop is yours now. Build something beautiful." It was good advice. I'd spent the past 6 months tearing down the life Greg and Denise had tried to steal from me. Now it was time to build something new. The first thing I built was a routine. I woke up at 6, made coffee, and spent an hour on the porch watching the mountains emerge from the morning mist. Then I'd walk down to the village center, a 20-minute hike that kept my legs strong and my mind clear. Asheville was full of retirees like me, people who'd chosen the mountains over the noise and complexity of city life. The second thing I built was connections. There's a diner called Mountain View on Main Street that serves the kind of breakfast Dorothy used to make eggs over easy, bacon, crispy, hash browns golden brown. The owner, a woman named Betty Sue Collins, had been running the place for 30 years and knew everyone in town. "You're the engineer from Ohio," she said on my third visit, like my reputation had preceded me. "Heard you sold your house out from under some family members who were trying to cheat you." Word traveled fast in small towns. I'd forgotten that about mountain communities. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but not in a judgmental way. It was more like an extended family keeping track of its members. "That's right," I said. "How'd you hear about it?" "My sister lives in Dover Springs. She saw you on the news. Said you gave those cheaters exactly what they deserved. We admire that kind of backbone around here." Within a week, I'd become a regular at Mountain View. Not just for the food, but for the conversation. The morning coffee crowd was a mix of retirees, local business owners, and folks who'd lived in the mountains their whole lives. They treated me like I'd been there for years, asking my opinion on everything from the weather to the construction project happening at the old schoolhouse. That's how I met Tom Bradley, the director of the Asheville Community Workshop. Tom was a retired high school shop teacher who'd started a program to teach woodworking skills to local teenagers. He was having trouble with some of the more advanced projects, and Betty Sue had suggested he talk to me. "Mr. Granger," Tom said over coffee one morning, "I heard you're a civil engineer with some woodworking experience. I've got a group of kids who want to build a gazebo for the town park, but I'm not sure about the structural engineering. Would you be willing to take a look at our plans?" I looked at the blueprints Tom spread across our table. They were good plans, ambitious for a group of teenagers, but there were a few issues with the foundation design and the roof support structure. Tom, I said, these kids have good instincts. With a few modifications, this could be something really special. That afternoon, I found myself in the community workshop, surrounded by a dozen teenagers who were more interested in their cell phones than in my advice. Until I started talking about the mathematics of load-bearing structures and the way a properly designed joint could distribute weight across multiple support beams. There's something magical about watching young people discover they can build something with their hands. Within an hour, those kids were asking questions about wood grain and joint strength, and the difference between structural and decorative elements. They reminded me of myself at that age, hungry to understand how things worked and eager to create something that would last. The gazebo project took 6 weeks. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I'd work with the kids, teaching them not just carpentry techniques, but the engineering principles behind them. We talked about stress distribution and weather resistance, and the importance of measuring twice and cutting once. But mostly, we talked about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Mr. Gee, one of the kids said, they'd started calling me that and I liked it better than Mr. Granger. Why did you wait until you were 81 to start teaching? I thought about that question while I helped him cut a complex angle joint. I guess I didn't know I was a teacher until I found students who wanted to learn. The gazebo was completed on a Saturday morning in December, and the whole town turned out for the dedication. It was a simple structure, 8-sided, with a cedar shake roof and benches around the perimeter, but it was solid. It would stand for decades, maybe longer. Standing in the town square, watching families gather around something I'd helped build, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about carpentry or engineering. It was about community, about passing on knowledge, about being useful instead of just being old. That evening, I was sitting on my porch with a glass of bourbon and a letter from Clara. She'd written to tell me about Maria's acceptance to North Carolina State University's veterinary program and to thank me again for the college fund. Mr. Granger, she'd written, you changed our lives, not just with your generosity but with your example. You showed us that it's never too late to fight for what's right, and it's never too late to start over. I folded the letter and looked out at the mountains. In the distance I could see the lights of Asheville twinkling like stars. It was a good place to be old, a good place to be useful, a good place to be myself. The next morning I woke up to my phone ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered I heard a voice I knew. Dad, it's Greg. I sat down at my kitchen table, looking out at the mountains, and waited for him to continue. Dad, I got your letter. I've been thinking about what you said, about the choices I made. I wanted to call and tell you, I wanted to tell you that you were right about everything. I didn't say anything. At 81, I'd learned the value of letting people fill their own silences. Denise and I are divorced. She's in counseling trying to deal with her problems. I'm living in a studio apartment in Columbus, trying to figure out what kind of man I want to be. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, really sorry. I thought about the gazebo in the town square, about the teenagers who'd learned to build something with their hands, about the community that had welcomed me without judgment. Greg, I said finally, I'm glad you're getting your life together, but I'm not waiting around to see if you succeed. I've got my own life to live now. There was a long pause. Dad, could I maybe come visit sometime, just to see how you're doing? I looked out at the mountains, at the life I'd built for myself, at the future I was still creating. Maybe, I said, but not yet. I'm not ready for that yet. After I hung up, I sat on my porch for a long time, thinking about forgiveness and second chances, and the difference between mercy and justice. The mountains were beautiful in the afternoon light, and I had nowhere else to be. At 81, I was learning that the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building a life so good that the people who tried to destroy you become irrelevant to your happiness. The phone rang again that evening, but this time I didn't answer. I was too busy planning my next project. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, just as I was finishing my coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. It was Ben Chavez, my lawyer from Dover Springs, and his voice carried a mixture of amusement and satisfaction that told me he had news. "Walter, I thought you'd want to know. Your son's situation has gotten complicated." I leaned back in my chair, cradling the phone against my ear. "What kind of complicated?" "Well, it turns out that when Greg and Denise got divorced, they had some financial issues to sort out. Greg's been living in that studio apartment I mentioned, working at a parts store in Columbus, barely making ends meet. Last week he got evicted." I felt something I hadn't expected. A flicker of concern, not for the man who tried to steal my house, but for the boy I'd once taught to ride a bicycle. "Where's he living now?" "That's the thing, Walter. He's been calling around asking friends if he can stay with them. Most of them have said no. Apparently word got around about what he did to you, and people aren't too eager to help someone who'd steal from his own father." I thought about that for a moment. Dover Springs was a small town, the kind of place where your reputation followed you everywhere. If the community had turned against Greg, he was truly alone. "Ben, why are you telling me this?" "Because he asked me to contact you. He wants to know if you'd be willing to help him. Not money for a house or anything like that, just enough to get back on his feet. Maybe $1,000 for a deposit on a new apartment." $1,000. I thought about the money sitting in my bank account, about the house I'd sold, about the life I'd built in Asheville. $1,000 was nothing to me now. But it wasn't about the money. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd pass along the message. Walter, I want you to know that you don't owe him anything. After what he did to you, you'd be perfectly justified in saying no." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. In the distance I could see the town square where the gazebo stood, surrounded by snow-covered benches. It was a beautiful sight, peaceful and permanent. "Then, I need to think about this. Give me a day or two." That afternoon I found myself at the community workshop, helping Tom Bradley prepare for a new project. We were building birdhouses for the local elementary school, and the kids were excited about the idea of creating homes for the creatures that shared their world. "Mr. Gee," one of the kids asked, "why do birds need houses? Can't they just live in trees?" I thought about that question while I helped him measure a piece of cedar. "Well, trees are good for nesting, but sometimes birds need extra protection. A well-built birdhouse can keep them safe from predators and weather. It's like giving them a second chance." Second chances. I worked with the kids for another hour, teaching them about proper drainage and ventilation, about the importance of building something that would last. But my mind kept drifting back to Greg, to the phone call, to the question of what mercy looked like when it came from someone who'd been betrayed. That evening I called Clara. She was working her way through nursing school, and Maria was thriving in her veterinary program. They'd both sent me Christmas cards, and I'd sent them updates about my life in Asheville. "Clara, I need some advice," I said. "It's about Greg." I told her about Ben's call, about Greg's situation, about the request for help. Clara listened without interrupting, the way she'd always done. "Mr. Granger," she said finally, "what does your heart tell you to do?" "My heart tells me to help him. My head tells me he doesn't deserve it." "Maybe it's not about what he deserves. Maybe it's about who you are." I thought about that conversation all night, lying in my bed and listening to the wind and the mountains. Clara was right. Of course, this wasn't about Greg. It was about the kind of man I wanted to be, the kind of legacy I wanted to leave. The next morning I called Ben back. "Ben, I've made a decision. I want you to send Greg a check for $1,000. But I want you to include a note." "What kind of note?" "I want you to tell him that this is the last money he'll ever get from me. Not because I'm angry, but because I'm done being his father. He's a grown man and he needs to figure out how to be responsible for his own life." Ben was quiet for a moment. Walter, are you sure about this? I'm sure. And Ben? I want you to add something else. Tell him that I hope he uses this money to build something better than what he tore down. But tell him he needs to build it himself. A week later, I got a call from the Dover Springs Gazette. They wanted to do a follow-up story about my situation, about how I was doing in North Carolina, about the community response to elder abuse cases. The reporter, Lisa Chen, was the same woman who'd interviewed me during the height of the controversy. She drove down from Columbus to meet me in person, and we talked for 2 hours about my new life, about the work I was doing with the teenagers, about the lessons I'd learned from the whole experience. "Mr. Granger," she said as we walked through the town square, "you've become something of a symbol for elder rights. People who've been taken advantage of by their families have been reaching out to you. Are you interested in becoming more involved in advocacy work?" I looked at the gazebo, at the solid construction and clean lines, at the way it anchored the town square and provided a gathering place for the community. "Lisa, I think I'm doing the advocacy work I'm meant to do. I'm showing people that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to fight for what's right. Never too late to build something better." The interview was published the following week, and the response was overwhelming. I got letters from elderly people all over the country sharing their own stories of family betrayal and financial abuse. Some of them were heartbreaking, stories of people who'd lost everything to greedy relatives and had no resources to fight back. But there were also stories of triumph, of people who'd found the courage to stand up for themselves, to seek help, to start over. Those letters reminded me that what had happened to me wasn't unique, but my response to it was. That evening I was working in my basement workshop, building a bookshelf for the town library, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered I heard a voice I knew. "Dad, it's Greg." I set down my chisel and waited for him to continue. "Dad, I got the money, and I got the note. I wanted to call and thank you, but also to tell you that I understand what you're saying. You're right. I need to figure out how to be responsible for my own life." I thought about the birdhouses we'd built for the elementary school, about second chances and the difference between help and enabling. "Greg, I hope you do figure it out. But I need you to understand something. This conversation doesn't change anything between us. I'm not your father anymore. I'm just a man who once knew a boy named Greg." There was a long pause. "I understand, Dad, and I'm sorry for everything." After I hung up, I went back to my workbench and continued building the bookshelf. It was going to be a beautiful piece, oak and walnut, with adjustable shelves and a finish that would last for generations. It would hold hundreds of books, thousands of stories, decades of accumulated wisdom. At 81, I was learning that the best gifts aren't the ones you receive, but the ones you create with your own hands and give away freely. The mountains were beautiful in the evening light, and I had work to do. Spring came early to the Blue Ridge Mountains that year, and I celebrated my 82nd birthday watching dogwood trees bloom outside my kitchen window. It had been almost a year since I'd left Ohio, almost a year since I'd sold the house out from under Greg and Denise, almost a year since I'd learned that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them. The morning of my birthday, I found a card slipped under my front door. It was from the teenagers at the community workshop, all 12 of them, with a message that made me smile. "Happy birthday, Mr. G. Thanks for teaching us that building things is about more than just wood and nails." They were right about that. Over the past year, I'd helped them build gazebos and birdhouses, planters and benches, but what we'd really built was something more important: confidence, skills, and the understanding that creating something with your hands is one of the most satisfying experiences life has to offer. That afternoon, I was working in my basement workshop when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but visitors weren't uncommon in Asheville. The mountain community had a way of drawing people together, especially people who'd found their way to the area looking for something they couldn't find anywhere else. When I opened the door, I found Clara standing on my porch, and behind her a young woman I recognized from photographs, Maria, now 19 and in her second year of veterinary school. "Mr. Granger," Clara said, her eyes bright with tears, "we wanted to surprise you for your birthday. We drove down from North Carolina State. I looked at these two women who'd become my family in ways that biology had never achieved, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete happiness. Clara, Maria, come in. Let me make you some coffee." We spent the afternoon on my porch, talking about Maria's studies, about Clara's final semester of nursing school, about the scholarship fund I'd established that was now helping 3 other students pursue careers in veterinary medicine. But mostly we talked about the future. "Mr. Granger," Maria said, "I want you to know that everything I've accomplished is because of you. Not just the money but the example you set. You showed me that it's never too late to fight for what's right." I thought about the night Clara had helped me discover Greg's plans to sell my house, about the way she'd treated me like a human being when everyone else treated me like a burden. "Maria, your mother saved my life. I was just returning the favor." That evening, after Clara and Maria had driven back to Raleigh, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon and a letter I'd been meaning to write. It was to Jim Patterson, my old lawyer in Dover Springs, and it contained instructions for the disposition of my remaining assets. The letter was part of a larger project I'd been working on for months, a memoir about my experience with elder abuse, about the importance of fighting back, about the possibility of starting over at any age. I'd been writing it in longhand, the way I'd learned to do blueprints back in engineering school, taking my time and getting every detail right. The memoir was nearly finished, 200 pages of story, advice and reflection. But more importantly, it was a document that could help other people in similar situations. I'd been in touch with a publisher in Atlanta who specialized in books about aging and elder rights, and they were interested in publishing it. The working title was Lessons from a Locked Door: How I Fought Back When My Family Tried to Steal My Life. It wasn't the most elegant title, but it was accurate, and accuracy mattered more than elegance when you were trying to help people understand their options. I decided to donate all the proceeds from the book to elder rights organizations, to legal aid societies that help seniors fight back against family fraud, to support groups for people who'd been betrayed by their own children. It seemed like the right thing to do with whatever time and resources I had left. The next morning I woke up to find a package on my doorstep. It was from Tom Bradley at the community workshop, and inside was a wooden plaque with an inscription: "Walter Granger, Master Builder. Thank you for teaching us that the most important thing you can build is character." I hung the plaque in my workshop, next to the tools Frank Morrison had left me, and spent the morning working on a new project, a rocking chair for the front porch of the elementary school. It was going to be a place where teachers could sit and read to their students, where children could rest after playing, where generations of young people could experience the simple pleasure of sitting still and watching the world go by. Around noon I took a break and walked into town for lunch at Mountain View. Betty Sue Collins greeted me with her usual warmth, and a slice of apple pie that she claimed was left over from yesterday but that I suspected she'd made specially for my birthday. "Walter," she said, sitting down across from me, "I heard through the grapevine that you're writing a book about what happened to you in Ohio." Word traveled fast in small towns, but I'd learned to appreciate the way mountain communities looked out for their members. "That's right, Betty Sue. I figure if my story can help other people avoid what I went through, it's worth telling. You know, I've been thinking about what you did. Selling that house, fighting back against your son, starting over here in Asheville. Takes a lot of courage to do what you did." I thought about courage, about the difference between being brave and being desperate. "Betty Sue, I don't think it was courage. I think it was just stubbornness. I was too old and too ornery to let them win." She laughed. "Well, whatever you call it, it worked. And now you're here teaching kids how to build things, writing books, making a difference. That's a pretty good ending to a pretty bad story." That afternoon I was working in my garden when I heard the phone ring. I almost didn't answer it. I was enjoying the spring sunshine and the satisfaction of planting tomatoes in soil that belonged to me. But something made me go inside and pick up the receiver. "Walter, this is Earl Tate." I smiled. Earl called me every few weeks, updating me on the construction business, on mutual friends in Dover Springs, on the general state of the world. He was one of the few people from my old life who'd stayed in touch, and I treasured our conversations. "Earl, good to hear from you. How are things in Ohio?" "Well, that's why I'm calling. I wanted to let you know that Greg's been asking around about you. Nothing threatening, just curious. He's apparently gotten his life together somewhat. Found a steady job, moved into a decent apartment, stopped drinking. He's been telling people that he wants to apologize to you properly." I thought about that for a moment. About forgiveness, about second chances, about the difference between mercy and justice. "Earl, what do you think I should do?" "Walter, I think you should do whatever feels right to you. You don't owe that boy anything, but you also don't owe him nothing. That's between you and your conscience." After I hung up, I sat on my porch for a long time watching the mountains change color in the afternoon light. I thought about Greg, about the man he'd become and the man he might yet become. I thought about the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball and the man who tried to steal my house. But mostly, I thought about the future. My future, the future of the young people I was teaching, the future of the elderly people who might read my book and find the courage to fight back against their own families. At 82, I'd learned that the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building a life so good, so meaningful, so full of purpose that the people who tried to destroy you become irrelevant to your happiness. The mountains were beautiful in the evening light, and I had work to do. Tomorrow I would finish the rocking chair for the elementary school. Next week I would complete the final chapter of my memoir. Next month I would start a new project with the teenagers at the community workshop. Greg could apologize or not apologize. He could get his life together or continue to struggle. He could learn from his mistakes or repeat them. It was his choice and his consequences. I had chosen peace, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of building things that would last longer than I would. At 82, I was finally exactly where I belonged.